We're receiving reports that Iranian security forces have fired guns and tear gas at protesters in Jina Mahsa Amini's hometown. Jina Mahsa Amini is the woman who died in police custody 40 days ago. Now, today marks the end of the traditional mourning period, and this video here from earlier, which DW has verified, shows dozens of protesters at the cemetery chanting slogans against the regime. Activists say security services warned Ms. Amini's family against holding a ceremony. Demonstrations elsewhere in Iran have been gaining momentum despite a crackdown which is said to have killed hundreds of people, including children. Women and girls are leading many of the protests and are being confronted by riot police on the street. Witnesses across Iran have spotted a heavy deployment of security forces. Many of the protesters are calling for the overthrow of the regime and the supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. He says the demonstrations are being orchestrated by foreign governments to undermine Iran and that protesters will be punished.
Death to Khamenei, death to the dictator. Slogans often heard during Iran's street protests. It's directed at this man, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, the supreme leader of the country. Since the beginning of the unrest in September, he has belittled his critics. He says the protests by Iranian women and girls are controlled from abroad.
It is quite clear that all this was planned by America and the fake usurping Zionist regime and their followers.
Khamenei has fought all his life for Iran to be an Islamic republic. He began training as a cleric during his childhood in the 1950s. At that time, Iran was ruled by the Shah, an autocrat who severely limited the influence of religion in the country. Khamenei joined the Ayatollah Khomeini's opposition movement. That, in 1979, overthrew the Shah to the cheers of millions. Khomeini died 10 years later, and Khamenei was chosen by the Religious Council of Experts to succeed him. Since then, he's been the supreme authority in Iran. There are regular presidential elections in the country, in which Khamenei also votes. But in the end, it is he, not the president, who has the final say. And he has made his positions clear, time and time again. In foreign policy, he sees the USA and Israel as arch enemies. He has repeatedly denied the Holocaust. Domestically, he relies on censorship, surveillance, and security forces to defend the ideals of the Islamic Revolution. Under Khamenei, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard has become a notorious force that has repeatedly quashed protests, including in recent weeks, following the death of Jina Mahsa Amini in police custody. Khamenei says he backs the crackdown.
They thought they could rip out the roots of the Islamic Republic, but that small sapling has now turned into a massive tree. Anyone who even thinks about uprooting this tree is completely wrong.
Khamenei once said that he is ready to sacrifice everything for the revolution and for Islam. And he has always defended his power, with few compromises.
The Iranian government has imposed sanctions on German politicians and institutions, including DW's Farsi service. The measures are said to have been prompted by the European Union's recent sanctions against the Tehran government over its brutal crackdown on ongoing protests. Responding to the move, DW's Director General Peter Limburg said the Iranian government has been threatening DW's Farsi editors and their families for some time now, and that this is unacceptable, adding that the regime promotes terrorism inside and outside the country. In a statement, he said, "I expect politicians in Germany and Europe to increase the pressure on the regime. The fact that we appear on such a list now will not stop us from providing our users in Iran with reliable information." Let's get a European perspective on this now. Swedish Social Democrat and member of the European Parliament, Evin Incir, is an Iran specialist, and she joins us now from Brussels. Very good to have you with us. I would just like to start by picking up on what we just heard, namely Tehran taking aim at members of the European Parliament as well as several German institutions, including DW's Farsi program, accusing them of supporting terrorism. What is your reaction to that?
Thank you for having me. This is actually how oppressing regimes and dictators react. Instead of understanding that it needs to be an end on the bloodbath that he has started, the Khomeini and the regime of the mullah, they are targeting those defending democracy and human rights. This means that the EU and the member states need to increase their sanctions against the mullahs, and included also, I should say, their families that are living in peace and freedom in Western countries.
So will increasing sanctions really do the trick? Last week, the EU imposed fresh sanctions against the morality police, as well as several Iranian officials. Now, to the people, though, in Iran, those who are risking their lives, why should they believe that these sanctions will bring about any real change when past sanctions haven't?
The sanctions that were adopted last week were just one step, and we were, of course, hoping that the situation in Iran will change, that the dictatorship of the mullahs will understand that the oppression that is taking place in the country cannot continue anymore, and that there will be a change. But we see that there hasn't been a change. And as we have stepped up and increased our sanctions against Putin, we also need to continue doing it against the mullahs, because when it affects their lives and when it affects their families' lives, then I think they will understand that they will not be able to continue this oppression against women, against minorities, against the population in the countries as they have been doing until now.
But piling sanctions on top of sanctions, and so far, no real effect, certainly not one wishes for. That looks like the EU can't really do much more against such a regime.
I would not say that it's piling sanction. It rather shows that we need to show our strength even more, that we haven't acted enough. I would like to, as I mentioned, see more sanction, increased sanctions, but also against the families of the mullahs and those behind the horrific situation right now. But I would also actually like to see a European Union that understand that maybe it's time to actually also expel the ambassadors of the mullahs in the European Union. So my answer to that is that we haven't done enough.
Well, thank you so very much for your time, European Parliament member and Swedish Social Democrat Evin Incir there, speaking to us from Brussels. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Now, Negin Shirageh is an Iranian activist and campaigner for women's rights who's now based in London. Welcome to DW. Let's start with your reaction to these 40-day-old protests. What goes through your mind when you see these women, girls, men and boys on the streets there?
It's really heartwarming to actually see this amount of bravery on the streets of Tehran. It's a really brutal crackdown, as you mentioned in your amazing report, that the government doesn't stop at anything. They just kill people on the streets. We just received a picture of a mom that has been killed in a car in front of her child just because she was filming with her mobile phone. It's really brutal on the streets, and the amazing pictures that we are seeing of the massive number of people going down on the streets and protesting. There's no word to describe it of how we are feeling. What we are doing outside Iran, we're just trying to be their voice and support them and find a ways to give them more encouragement and fuel to be able to continue asking for what they're asking for. The reality is there's not much we can do as outsiders other than these kind of emotional support. But I think that the outside governments, the international community can do much bigger things, and they haven't got to that point yet.
OK. When the Ayatollah says that these protests are controlled by the US and Israel, what's your response?
Oh, this is like been repeated. It's like a tape recording that has been repeated for 43 years. So nobody actually believes it. And the truth is, when you see the people on the streets taking their life in their hands, children at the schools, high schools, they've been beaten to death. There is no way that a government outside would say stop or do it would affect the people and what they're doing. It's something that is coming from their lived experiences, and there's no outside force that can tell people how to deal with this situation, because if it was that, they could have done it much earlier or stop it now from happening. It's something that, as an Iranian that has been exposed to that on a daily basis when I was living in Iran, and when I moved outside as well in different ways, I can guarantee that there is no hands playing outside that can actually encourage people to go on the streets.
So looking at the brutality of the crackdown, and there are some reports that more than 140 people have been killed. If we presume that the regime will not back down and will continue to kill you if you go out on the streets, what is the most that protesters can hope for?
I think what protesters are asking and demanding right now from the slogans they're asking is a strike overall in all the sections of the country. But it's a really difficult thing because a strike worked really well 43 years ago when Islamic Revolution happened. So the oil industry went on the strike, different parts of the country, and then that led to the collapse of the government. What happened during the 4 decades is that the Iranian economy changed massively, and part of it, especially after the sanctions. So it's not a centralized economy anymore. It's in the hands of the IRGC. It's really like a small groups of. This is the Revolutionary Guard. So they're basically running the country and the economy of the country. So going on a strike in the oil fields doesn't actually mean anything anymore, because the oil production is lower.
But I would like to press you on this. So we have a crackdown and we have angry protesters on the streets. We have a call for a general strike, which you say you think is unlikely to be effective. How does this end if the regime says we will not back down and we will kill you if you keep this up?
I think the thing that we are pushing for is, try to do the strikes, but the most important part is getting the people who are close to the regime just to stop working with them and be on their side. I see that the number of brutalities that are happening on the streets it's leading to a lot of people, their cronies, their children, to just try and stop supporting them. And I think when that support stops, everything would change.
Good talking to you. Thank you for joining us and outlining that so clearly. Iranian activist and women's rights campaigner Negin Shirage.
And joining us now from London, let's bring in Shadi Sadar. She is a human rights lawyer and executive director of the NGO Justice for Iran. Welcome to the program, and thank you so much for joining us. I'd like to ask you a little bit more about the reaction that we saw there in that report. Harshness and resolve on the part of Khamenei. Tell us, is this the only reaction that you think we might expect on his part?
I'm afraid it's the reality of that the protesters should deal with on a daily basis. So the only language that the regime communicates with those who protest is violence. And it has been like this since the inception of the Islamic Republic in 1979, 1980.
You are very familiar. You have close ties with people who are in the country, and we're just hearing all of these reports of further arrests and detentions. Walk us through what you're hearing. What happens to those who end up in prison because of the protests?
One of the tactics that the regime has used to suppress the uprising is mass arrest. So they have not only arrested thousands of protesters, but also almost everyone who is or could potentially be an agent of change. That includes lawyers, intellectuals, writers, artists, unionists, women's rights activists, human rights defenders, and so on and so forth. And so the condition in the detention centers is dire. The detention centers are overcrowded, and more importantly, the use of torture is widespread. And the detainees are subjected to all kinds of torture and ill treatment, including sexual abuse and rape. And we don't expect fair trials for those who have been arrested. From the previous experiences, we know that there would be a few minutes trial without free access to the lawyers, and then the detainees would be sentenced to punishments that had been already dictated by the security apparatus.
And your NGO, Justice for Iran, you're trying to do something about that, in terms of holding Iranian officials accountable for human rights abuses. Just walk us through how big of a challenge that is, given the power structures that are in place.
Justice for Iran is not only documents the gross human rights violations, but also collect information about perpetrators. So since the beginning of the uprising, we have made several calls to the public to help us in identifying those responsible for the crackdown, and send us evidence about their involvement in gross human rights violations. So we have received thousands of communications, and we are making files about hundreds of perpetrators at the moment, hoping that those files will be used to hold perpetrators accountable using every single accountability mechanisms that are available at the international level, such as human rights sanctions. But more importantly, I think, this has been the hopes of those who send us those information and risk their lives, basically, by sending us this information, that these information and these files will would be used in a very near future in the transitional justice process that would take place in Iran, hopefully very soon.
Thank you so much. Shadi Sadar, as you mentioned, human rights lawyer and executive director of the NGO Justice for Iran. We appreciate it.